Is there a strategy that'll help you grow your company faster? CEO Sales Strategies is an investigative business podcast for entrepreneurial people who never stop asking questions. Highly acclaimed sales revenue growth expert Doug C. Brown interviews CEOs, business owners, and professionals who serve them to uncover and share actionable tips and methods behind their bulletproof sales strategies. Topics covered on the show include their failures, struggles, secrets, and processes that help them succeed in selling millions to billions of dollars of their products and services, all with the sole aim of helping you grow your business. If you are eager to know the most effective sales secrets from the A players of the game, then the CEO Sales Strategies podcast is certainly the place to be.
Hey everyone, this is Doug C. Brown with the CEO Sales Strategies podcast, bringing you another great episode. We have Ashley Graham through the Conscious Publicist, and we're going to talk about podcast and what the value of podcast and pitching podcast are and how to pitch. And here's the reality. If you're not putting yourself on podcasts today, you're missing out on a lot of opportunity. There are so many people listening to podcasts today. There are people in B2B, B2C, B2E, that's business to entrepreneur. And the reality is that, the more you can get yourself out in that public square, the better. And why not do it through other people's networks? And podcasts are one of those ways of absolutely doing that. But when you're pitching yourself onto a podcast, there is a process. Or for our folks in Europe and other places, it's a process. So you want to understand what that is. You must understand what that is in order to have success. Otherwise, you're going to pitch and they're going to say no. So without further ado, we're going to go right to the interview. Let's welcome Ashley in. Ashley, welcome to the CEO Sales Strategies podcast. I'm so grateful you're here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I really am grateful because you and I have had several conversations, and each time we have it, it's like, I just love our conversations. And you're just so smart, right? And I think I called you the goddess of PR before, and you said, okay, let's have that stick. So your company is the Conscious Publicist, correct?
Correct. Yes.
So I'm really excited to have you here because I get asked this question that we're going to talk about all the time, which is, how do I get on podcasts? So you have this thing that you put together, I'd say a program that you put together on how to pitch podcasts and win conscious conversation. But it's really kind of the A to Z on how do you get on a podcast? How do you pitch it? And how do you do it the right way so that you win? So it's a win-win play. Did I get that right?
Absolutely. Yes, there is so much information in this thing. I just keep referring to it as a wealth of knowledge. Everything more from the traditional PR sense, covering how to build relationships, especially if you've never had a pre-existing relationship with somebody in the media facing side before. What's the appropriate way to make conscious relationships with those media individuals, regardless of what media platform it is. But then also the elements and the ebbs and flows of what it's like to more or less cold pitch media. Again, if you've never had an existing conversation with them before, but then also how to kind of nurture your pre-existing media relationships through podcasts specifically, how to own and get your message out there, how to create your assets needed to be on podcasts, and basically every other thing that goes within the podcasting space, as well as PR space of understanding your reach, the results that come out of podcasts, and all the things.
And so everybody listen up. If you are not on podcast actively, start doing it. Here's the reason why. I started my podcast a little over a year ago, but I was getting on other people's podcasts at the same time. And, I put some money into the podcast to build it and all, but I got a 4X return on my first year in my podcast. And here's the reason I'm telling everybody to get on their own podcast, because what happens is people hear us on other podcasts and then they go, whoa, who's this person? And so they checked me out and they found out I had a podcast. So they started listening to my podcast, and that deepened the relationship. And I was able to actually book quite a few, 4 reasonably large size clients off that particular podcast. I wouldn't say they're like mega clients, but they're reasonably sized, right? So you never know where it's going to come from. But if it started with other podcasts, then translating into them coming and exploring mine more, as well as exploring a lot of other things that I do. And I've built some really great relationships through podcasting. So it's not, I don't even say, actually, I want your opinion on this. To me, it's not even, should I anymore? It's a must.
Absolutely. There is a huge opportunity you're missing if you are not pursuing being on other people's podcasts. But then I also think it goes on the other tail end of that, that there is a huge opportunity to also explore yourself being a podcast host or launching your own podcasting platform, which is another way of just getting your message out there. Everything's very synchronistic at the end of the day, and everything kind of feeds one another. It's just where you really want to put your time and attention. And again, there's a huge opportunity if you're not exploring the podcasting space, because it's so prevalent in our conversations nowadays, well, at least for me.
Yeah, it really is. And so, there's an age difference between us, right? So, I've got 30 years on you basically. And so in my generation, which is the end of the baby boomers, podcasts are even popular there. And a lot of people think, well, geez, they're getting older. Why would they listen to these podcasts? Well, the reality is we do. And I remember when podcasting was just starting to come out, like about 20 years ago, people were talking about podcasts and people were like, what is this crazy thing, right? But now podcasts really are starting to supersede traditional radio.
Mm-hmm.
Because, we used to advertise all the time on Sirius XM radio and different radio stations and things like that. We don't do that at all. Not just for this business, but businesses that I've been involved with. I mean, we've spent like, $1.4 million a year just on Sirius XM radio broadcasting, and the reality is we wouldn't even entertain that today, because you could do this now through podcast much more effectively, much more targeted than, putting it out on, say, a radio broadcast.
Absolutely.
All right. So you've convinced me. Let's say I'm listening and you got that far, right? So how do I pitch to a podcast? What do I do? What's the first step or the first stage that I need to figure out?
Yeah, I think the first step is always good. It's always good to have an understanding of what the purpose is of pitching podcasts and what you really hope to get out of it. And I've never been a data and analytical person. I think that there's a lot of value there, but I think the relationship part and actually understanding the story and message that you have to share is really what drives the value. So if you've had kind of a stream of consciousness or a thought that you wanted to appear on a podcast, it's really good to tune in to kind of that thought process as to why you're wanting to appear on podcasts, and then what are the steps that you need to take from there, which would be step 2, 3, so on and so forth. But usually anybody that has kind of thought about getting on a podcast, they usually have a statement or a purpose as to why they want to appear on the podcast, and then they just kind of follow suit from there. So I guess just step 1 is just always leading through the impact and the purpose through what you have to share through the podcast, and then continue with the steps moving forward.
I think it's really important to understand what people are looking for when they're going into podcast, and trying to get onto the podcast. I know in the beginning of my career, when I was doing this, I didn't really pay much attention to it. So I'd be like, I'll get on anybody's podcast. I don't care. And that was good, I think, for in the beginning to kind of get some understanding of what they were like. But, I had a broadcasting background, well, DJ background, right? So it was a lot easier for me to get onto a podcast. I know some of my clients that I've helped actually understand what to say on podcasts and how to say it and how to present themselves. They didn't have that experience. So for me, it was like, I just want to get on there and try and get some experience out of there. But I absolutely agree with you that we should know our target, because if we're getting on to, say, a personal development podcast, but we're selling business to business and we don't have a spin on that, on the personal development, then we get practice. It's not bad, but you're probably not going to get a lot of calls out of that, or you get a lot of contacts out of that. So you can tell I'm older because, calls. My my daughters tell me, Dad, I already know if you're over 40 or under 40, because if you're over 40, you make a phone call. If you're under 40, you don't. But I mean, there's a lot of social media and a lot of things that happen and contacts that happen through LinkedIn or Facebook or whatever. But the reality is, once I started getting much more targeted, then I was having targeted conversations, which led to actual sales.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important. Okay, so I figure out who am I and what do I want on the podcast. Now, what do I do?
I think step 2 from there would be kind of understanding maybe where you would want to show up or how you want to position yourself of what I call a thought leader. And I believe that guests who do appear on podcasts are thought leaders to some degree, because they are using their own personal experiences, their expertise as a way to not only gain influence and awareness, but then also knowing how to naturally kind of fuel that conversation that is being taken place on the podcast. And it's really not that difficult to really position yourself as a thought leader, but there are things that you can be mindful of, again, of where you want to show up and other potential marketing elements that do connect with the podcast itself. And I'll just spitball some ideas of just natural things on how you can start to think about positioning yourself as a thought leader once you've come to the realization of step 1 of understanding your message and your story, is start to build the elements that do give you that credibility. And so again, just spitfiring some ideas, it would be your website, having a social media presence on LinkedIn, nurturing an email newsletter, or other marketing things that could be through, unique pieces on your blog, and just other things that are connected to a lot of marketing drivers, but then also fuel into, again, that message and the story and what your expertise is.
I think you said some gold there that I'm going to repeat back, because this was one of the things, like when I had a blog, I have a blog, right? So firstly, you got to get out into the public square. Mm-hmm. Today, sales has changed. Business has changed. If we're not out in that public square, which is really the media at this point, it's whatever media, digital media. If we're not out into the digital media forum, people are checking us out. And I never really realized this, but I used to do a lot of videos, a lot of recording, because I just like to do it. And I was putting them out there, and then I stopped for a while, and I was actually getting people contacting me and going, "What the heck's going on?" And I'm like, "Oh, what do you mean?" And they're like, "You haven't put out a video in 3 weeks." And I'm like, "Well, I just don't feel like doing it anymore. It's not part of my business model." And they're like, "Well, I liked them." Right. And they would get into arguing with me and yelling at me because I wasn't putting this content out. And what happened was, I realized that you never know when somebody's going to call you from this particular type of content. So if you do a podcast like you and I are doing right now, it might be tomorrow morning when the thing, releases, and then you get calls from it. Or it might be somebody listens to this 8 months from now, and all of a sudden you get a call. And I realized that when people were calling me off of the podcast that I was doing, or sending me an email or sending me something on LinkedIn, it didn't happen day one. But the more I was out there, so I think that's the message. You've got to be out there on a consistent basis. And I think that's brilliant, that people must realize. And I always tell people, look, don't prepare for now, prepare for a year from now, because you just don't know. You got to look out about a year and just keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing it.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
If they do that, they keep pitching and keep, positioning, somebody's going to respond. Now, I want to go back to the thought leader thing, because, traditionally a thought leader is thought about like coaches or authors or speakers or whatever, but it's really not. It's anybody in any industry, I suspect. Would you agree with that statement or refute it?
Absolutely. And again, I'll kind of just tie into what I believe a thought leader to be. And it does ring true to those titles as well. It's coaches and authors. They are taking their experiences and bringing them to the forefront from an audience perspective, a client's perspective, or even just a media perspective, usually through written or spoken word. And I think just as human beings, and this always speaks to more of the conscious element, which is why I call myself the conscious publicist, is we all have the same human experiences at the end of the day. It's just in our own unique way in different periods of time that we always can learn from other people. And so thought leaders, I think really just that we get our titles as thought leaders, or you would get your title as a thought leader, is because you continue to nurture your experience and find little nuggets of information and transformation that you can then give other people to kind of maybe help them along their journeys, professionally or personally.
The thing I've learned also about being on other people's podcasts or doing my own is that the initial, I would say, fable of only people who have smaller businesses are interested in doing podcasts or listening to podcasts or doing anything like that. Because I've heard that a lot through the industries, right? Well, yeah, who's listening to us? We are a $400 million manufacturing company. Why would we want to do a podcast, right? But I also realized even guests who came and applied to be on my podcast, this one here, I mean, I've had people who have billion-dollar companies. I have one guy sold his company and made over $1 billion just personally on the sale, never mind the other people that were in the company as well. And certainly lots of, $50 million to $500 million companies. So there's a lot of power in podcasts today where I think, those who haven't embraced that are kind of missing out, because there are people who run those type of companies. There are also people on the B2C side, or, the B2 thought leader, the B2E side, entrepreneur side, who are listening. But a lot of times people think, oh, it's just kind of like people who don't have much to do. They're kind of the people listening to the podcast. And my experience has been totally different. What about yours? As far as like you deal with clients all the time, are they listening to podcasts, or are they, not?
With my clients specifically, I don't really know too much about the experience of them actually listening in on podcasts, but they do know the value of what it is to be a guest on other people's podcasts, because they understand their expertise and they understand their message of impact. Now, I do know that some of my clients do listen to podcasts, which is kind of one of our conversations that we usually have before retaining myself as a publicist is, they are kind of aware as far as their attention in all forms of media, which is usually the things that it takes for someone to get to a place of wanting to work with a publicist, because they already have that understanding of what it's like to be in the media facing and what return they get from that. Let me know if that answers your question.
Oh, it does. And what I loved
Okay.
about how you answered it was with the highest integrity ever. You're like, well,
good.
hey, I'm not sure this part of the, where other people who might have come on this podcast would have gone, oh yeah, let me give them the answer they may want to hear. Right. You just like, which tells me the integrity of which you carry yourself. You always have in all our conversations. But it's nice to see it demonstrated while we're, recording our podcast. So that's awesome. Okay. So I figured out why I'm doing this. I figured out that I want to do this. I now know I have some possible bigger exposure than I even had thought about. I can even maybe get more clients, and certainly, utilize the podcast for other purposes. So I've got there. Now what do I do after I've identified, okay, this is what I want to do, how I want to do, how do I actually get to the pitching part? Because that's kind of the fun part.
Yeah. From there of understanding kind of what the pitching process looks like is already having kind of an idea of where you might want to start pitching. And this is where there is a lot of value for thought leaders, or in this case, it'll be my clients or such as yourself, for them to actually listen in on podcasts to understand where that connecting point on why they would even want to be on podcast. So it is always good and recommended to listen in on other podcasts, small and large, for you to naturally start thinking about maybe potentially being a guest on there. And then this just comes from research and development, which is an integrated part of anybody's role, is starting to do some due diligence, looking at what podcasts are out there, again, small or large, and tuning into pre-existing episodes that they've already published, how they nurture their marketing online, how they nurture their relationships online, and then maybe start pulling them into kind of your podcast target list on who you would want to pitch before you actually get to the pitching part. So there is a lot of value that comes out of due diligence and actually listening in on the podcast that you want to pitch. And again, this is definitely from the DIY side of things. Now, as a publicist, that is my responsibility to listen in on the podcast to understand where that connection point is made. So I do listen to a lot of podcasts.
Well, it's nice to know you do. I mean, because when we've identified, or we're starting to identify in the beginning, doing that due diligence, I would always go up and, no, you don't have to listen to the whole podcast, but you got to listen to enough. And I would always make reference of, hey, I listened to episode 32. I listened to episode 147. I like these two things about what happened in each episode. And the people know it was real at that point. So they're like, wow, thank you for listening. Now, the other thing I found, and again, I don't know if this is supposed to be done or not, but this is what I did, was I actually many times went up and reviewed and gave that podcast a good review if I liked it, for sure. Or if I didn't like it, I wouldn't apply for it anyways, and I wouldn't review it. And also you subscribe to the podcast. And then you let them know, hey, I subscribed. I gave you a 5-star review. Here's my review. And they love that. That's what I found anyways.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone, and I can always speak more from just content creators or creators who are utilizing their skill sets or utilizing their time and energy to create things for other people. We all like to be appreciated, right? And so that's just giving them that appreciation, like, what you're doing is incredible. Keep it up. And I'm going to support you with something that is just as easy as just leaving a review on what my experience was tuning in.
I think it's so important, like, because I even know when people do that with me on this podcast, because I don't know, it's kind of lonely out there when you're doing your own podcast, right? It's like, is anybody listening? You can see the numbers, but the reality is when I get people sending things in, it's like, I really appreciated what you were doing. Like even those people, that yelled at me when I stopped doing certain things, it was really nice to hear from them, even though it was like, they were not really even kind about it. They were just like, hey, you're letting us down, pal. It made me feel valued, right? Because sometimes, you're putting all this content out and you just never know. So, and you can normally see it in the rankings and stuff, but that's not really necessarily how it's even touching the human being.
Yes.
And so here's what I learned on podcasts. We, being guests on podcasts, sometimes say that the things that we kind of go like, I think that was okay. But someone else says that changed my life. Like, I'm hoping that people cue in on everything we're talking about, but I really hope they cue in on the fact of the integrity in which you carry yourself. Because when we carry ourselves with such integrity as you do, it makes it really easy to refer you.
Yep.
Because now, as the referrer, my biggest concern when I'm making referrals, and I've already talked with people about who you are. So it's one of those things when we're making that referral, our biggest consideration is the relationship we're actually referring into. But when we know this person has high integrity and does what she says, in your case, speaks the truth, not honesty, but the truth, then it makes it so much easier. So, I'm hoping somebody picks that up and uses it in sales, for example. And so they're not bending the truth in order to manipulate the sale, because it always not always, it comes back at times and bites people. But the reality is, there's so much that we've talked about, even in this, on how do you get ready to pitch. And speaking of pitching, I'm not going to end this podcast without pitching. You got a program actually on this, because it's called the Podcast Pitching Bundle. And it's chock full of way more value than I'll say you're asking for in return. So can we talk a few moments about that? Like what's in the, how to pitch with conscious conversations? What I'm going to come up, I'm going to invest in this thing. What am I getting?
Yeah. So I'll just kind of start with all of the elements that are in this bundle. And I'm probably sure I could come up with an even more clever, creative name for it. But I'm like, it is a bundle because it's everything from the pitching side. So It comes with a 117 page, basically training manual with actual prompts and cues that you can do from understanding what your core message is, maybe questions that you would want to be asked on the podcast. As far as information on where to even find podcasts, something as like bare roots for the potential podcast guest who has never even really truly listened into podcasts just yet. I'm digressing, but it basically covers everything from the bare roots of just understanding what it is to be a guest on a podcast, understanding what your message is, and then everything from the publicist or PR side of things of actually pitching a podcast. So that's in this 117 page ebook, but then there also are pre-built training pages where you can go and start writing out your message, writing out the questions you want to be asked, understanding where you want to start being featured as a podcast guest, but then also how to track the more measurable things from the numbers. Now, again, you'll learn through even just my messaging and how I positioned this. It's not to start thinking from a numbers perspective. It is to start thinking about what the purpose of the message is, what your expertise is, and how that's going to impact the audiences that are already found within those podcasts that you are going to be pitching. So that's basically everything in there, and everything's on the page too that kind of goes into that a little bit further.
We're speaking with Ashley Graham of the Conscious Publicist, and one of the most humble people I've had on this podcast. So how long did it take you to put this thing together?
Let's see. It took me about 3 full months just to understand the content part of it. And then it probably took me another 3 or 4 weeks to actually build it and design it. I'm also a recovering perfectionist. So that's probably another reason why it took so long. But I also am, a busy individual. I had clients to serve as well as manage all of their outreach campaigns. So yeah.
The reason I asked that is because I know what it's like to be on the other side of this and not have that ability to have something put together. And I will tell our listeners, I promise you that if you don't have your act together when you're pitching a show, then they're going to feel just like any type of relationship, a business relationship. If they feel any level of fear, then what's going to happen is they're going to turn you down. And I know this because I do the same thing. People pitch to come onto this particular podcast, and I look at it and I go, there's something not right here. It's just not right. And it's like, no, sorry. Right. And so, by the way, guys and gals, that could be from even the pictures you send in. That could be from the way your website is set up. A lot of these things, people like myself will actually have one of my team members go look and say, okay. And then my team members will bring it back to me and say, look at these pictures that, here on social media, and it's the guy doing questionable things, on a beach party or something like that. Well, I deal with a lot of high integrity businesses. That's not going to fit my brand. So when you're pitching, if you can't I tell people to think about this like a resume. If you're sending in a resume, it's got to stand out from all the other resumes. Otherwise, it's not going to. And especially when we're pitching shows that have very high traffic volume. What I love what you put together was you took the complexity and the mystery out of doing it. And yeah, painstakingly over 4 months because you're an ultra perfectionist at this. But the reality is you did all the work. So someone doesn't have to spend not just 4 months, because you know what you're talking about.
Yes.
They could spend 4 months burning $30,000 just making mistakes. And you've taken that and put it all into a really cool bundle for people. So I highly recommend it. It's called How to Pitch Podcast. Win the conscious conversation, or doing the conscious conversation. And you call it the podcast pitching bundle. So I check it out on, is it on the Conscious Publicist?
Yes.
Okay. Just want to make sure. Don't want to pitch. So Ashley, I really appreciate you being on here. It's a pleasure as always to speak with you. You're every time I talk to you, I'm like integrity. So I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you. That honestly means a lot. I hold that very near and dear because it is, I think, important, and it's what we need more of in the media space, regardless of what it is. So
that's the truth. Because I've dealt with a lot of people in the space that you're in, and most of them, no, I shouldn't say this way. There's a lot of great people, but a lot of them are just there to sell something versus actually to deliver the value on the PR side that actually can significantly change the trajectory of a business if it's done the right way.
Absolutely.
So thanks for being on the integrity side of that. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
All right, folks, we're talking with Ashley Graham of The Conscious Publicist. Ashley, thanks again. And I'd like to have you back on another podcast.
That would be great. You let me know when, and I'm there.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I hope that you got from this podcast, hey, I got to be a guest on podcast, and it's not really that difficult. And, if you want to understand how to do it appropriately, just get the podcast bundle that Ashley's putting out. I purchased it myself to read through that because I wanted to see if I was missing anything. And the reality is that the more podcasts that you can get on, and by the way, it usually costs nothing to get onto a podcast. So your marketing budget is usually pretty close to zero on this thing. Once you're on these podcasts, you get exposure to other people's networks. People share podcasts, so you get the actual exploding or exponential growth of people's networks. And the reality is you get the credibility from the other person validating you because you're on their podcast. So you've got instant rapport with that audience. And knowing what you want to know, knowing what you want to talk about, you'll be very targeted on that, and it will bring you leads. Now, I will tell you again, it may bring you leads tomorrow after the podcast runs, or it may take time to do that. But the more you do these things, the better you'll get at it, the more people will respond, and the more you will extend your reach. So until next time, go out, sell a lot of things, sell them profitably, be happy, make a lot of money. And if you want help with any aspect of either hiring, managing, training, supporting, or how do you find and become yourself a player, an elite performer, one of those top 1% of sales producers globally, reach out to me at Doug Brown 1234 at LinkedIn. Reach out to me at Doug at ceosalesstrategies.com. Or just give us a call at 603-595-0303. And if you like this podcast, as always, please be a subscriber. Tell your friends about it. Put up a 5-star review. I'd be very grateful if that would be the case. Until next time, this is Doug Brown with the CEO Sales Strategy Podcast, signing off for now. Have an awesome day, and to your success.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the CEO Sales Strategies Podcast. What is something that you learned that you could act on today? Don't forget to schedule it now, or it may never get forward momentum. If you find our content valuable, please leave a favorable review and let us know what you liked. Please also share this with others if the content will help them. For our show notes, other episodes, and more interesting content and resources, please visit ceosalesstrategiespodcast.com. See you soon, and to your continued success.